Okay.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube video. I'm here with Elvira Groezinger, and Elvira was born in 1947 in Poland and as a child of Holocaust survivors. She grew up in Israel, received her BA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in English and in French literatures and Jewish history and the history of the arts. Since 1967, Elvira has been living in Germany, and she's translated Translators Diploma from the University of Heidelberg, studied with German literature and Jewish studies in Frankfurt on the Main, and she has her doctorate in General and Comparative Literature from the Freie, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, University in
Berlin.
All right. And she's also the author of 9 books, mainly on Jewish culture and literature, and over 200 scholarly articles and reviews. Elvira is married. Elvira is married to Professor Emeritus of Religious and Jewish Studies, Karl Groezinger. He's affiliated professor of the University of Haifa. They have one married daughter who's a dermatologist and 2 grandchildren. And so I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Obligations of Memory podcast, Elvira. And I'm going to just start right in by asking you to tell a little bit about your parents, what you know of your parents' pre-war days, their families, their customs, the religious aspects of their lives, and then we'll walk a little bit through their Holocaust experience, but we'll not spend that much time there. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
But I still see this, just a minute. It's something, do you see me?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, my mother was from Siedlce. This is 80 kilometers east of Warsaw. It was a big Jewish community of 37 until 39% of the population there. My grandfather, who came from a family of Kotzker Rebbe, but wasn't Hasid anymore. He was Polonized and modernized, had a printing house. It was called Artystyczna, the artistic printing house, and was printing books and all kinds of things. Hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah. And he is mentioned in the otherwise very un-Jewish Siedlce today, but there are 2 books about personalities in Siedlce, and they mention my grandfather there twice as one of the famous printers. His posters are in the National Library of Poland because they were so well printed and are interesting. My grandfather was a friend of the later Marshal of Poland, Józef Piłsudski. Maybe you know him, I don't know. Anyway, he was anti-Russian at the beginning of the 20th century. Poland was still under Russian rule, and Austrian and so on, divided. And my grandfather printed illegal pamphlets against Russia, against the Tsar, for Piłsudski. Piłsudski was then a rebel, and it was very dangerous because who was caught went to Siberia. And so it was, of course, a dangerous task, and Piłsudski and my grandfather remained friends all the years. My mother was born in 1912, and she was educated at home. It was Jewish girl. This was not a, there was no school for Jewish girls at the time in that place. But my grandfather wanted her to attend a Polish high school, gymnasium. There was a Catholic elite school which did not accept Jewish girls. It was for girls only, but no Jewish girls were accepted. But my grandfather didn't give up and called the Marshal of Poland and told him the problem. And the Marshal intervened, and my mother was able to attend the high school for Polish, not Jewish girls. She finished this high school, graduated, and started studying dental medicine in Warsaw. This was not far away. And this is very important because it saved her life during the war. She finished her studies just before the war broke out, and she was treating Germans and everybody under the false name of Lipska. Her name was really Lichtenbach, but she was Lipska Maria, had a little blonde hair, and she didn't look that Jewish anymore. So she could survive, and she married my father, whom she met during her studies. My father was studying medicine in Warsaw as well, and they got married after the beginning of the war. And my father had to hide because he was very dark after him. I was after him. And he was circumcised, and it was just too dangerous for him to be outside. So he had to hide the whole time. And my mother was working in different places where they always changed the place, the hiding place they were in. And so she practically dragged him over the years.
Where was he hiding, Elvira?
He was hiding in different houses of people who were helpful. Mm-hmm. They had the room, an apartment. My mother is a doctor, and he was just hiding there. And
was he being helped by non-Jews, or was he being hidden
by Poles, by Germans, Volksdeutsche? These were there was a woman whose Polish husband, she was a German national, and they were supposed to go back to the Reich. Hitler said all the Germans should leave Poland and go home to Germany. She didn't want to because she was married to a Polish professor. And the first thing the Germans did when they came into a city, they caught the intelligentsia and shot them. So her husband was one of the executed at the beginning, and she hated the Germans. So she hid my parents for a while. And but her brother, it was one of the few stories I heard from a friend of my mother, because my parents never talked about it. Her brother was in the SS, and he was helping his sister without knowing that the people who lived in her place were Jewish. My father never showed up, but my mother was there, and another Jewish woman who was pregnant was there. And so all of them had happy evenings with the SS, drinking, laughing. And my mother, she never laughed again naturally. It was always some kind of acting. You know, it was natural laughter. I didn't understand it at the beginning, but then I understood it. She was always playing a role. And this German brother, his Esmond, he brought over his comrades. They were all drunk, and they were looking for the Jews in the closet. it was fun. They were just making fun, and they said they're going to look for Jews hiding. It was not funny, but of course everybody laughed. And the problem was the pregnant friend of my mother's and of the other lady. She wanted to hide. She had no nerves for these evenings, and she said, "I'm going to hide myself in the closet." And my mother and the other lady said, "No, never hide. You have to stay there and play a role." And the first thing they did, open a closet, and she wasn't there. So this was one of the times when their life was saved, and by chance. And I think that's why I heard about it.
So
Otherwise, I know very little about their stages during the war, but my parents were for a short time in the ghetto in Warsaw. But at the beginning, you could go out to work. So my mother was working as a doctor outside, and she could provide false papers for my father and herself. And then slowly she bought others. And with these papers, they fled from the ghetto and hid outside. But the rest of the family, this was my grandmother, my father's mother, my father's brother, older brother who was a doctor, his young wife, they were freshly married, and a baby who was born, a boy, shortly before the outbreak of the war. And on the other side were my grandparents, my mother's parents, and her older brother who was a lawyer. And my parents they smuggled the false documents into the ghetto to get them out, but no one was there anymore. It was too late. And they don't know how they died, whether they were deported or no one knows. I don't even know the name of my cousin, the only cousin I had, the baby. I don't know what was his name. My parents never mentioned them again.
Okay, so let's take it a little further. So how did the war is over in 1945?
Right. Before 1944, the end, when the Russian Soviet army was moving to the west, they joined the Polish army, which was, so to speak, included into the Soviet army. And my parents were there in the medical corps. And they...
For the Russians?
No, Poles. This was the Polish army.
Okay.
The Poles joined them because this was the only possibility to, to fight the Germans, because the Polish army, as it was at the beginning of the war, was decimated. There was nothing there. So it's a Polish division called Polish Army in the Soviet army. And my parents came almost to Berlin as doctors, and then the war was at the end, and they returned to Poland to look for the family they hoped to find, the relatives. Otherwise, they wouldn't have returned, but they hoped that there's someone left. And they looked for them via Red Cross and so on, but didn't find anybody. And then they were forced, my parents, to, it was Lower Silesia. Lower Silesia was German, but the Germans were thrown out from there by the Polish authorities at the Treaty of Peace, and the Germans had to leave, and the Poles had to leave from East Poland, which is now Ukraine, Lemberg and all this, Galicia. They were deported to Lower Silesia, and my parents, together with other Jews who survived, many of them who came with the army from the West, this was behind the border, they were, so to speak, forced to organize the medical system in Lower Silesia. It was not destroyed, the city where I was born. It is Hirschberg in the mountains, in Riesengebirge it is called. It was a very nice place, and there were houses and so on. And my parents organized this medical service, and then they wanted to leave Poland because they saw there's nothing there and it was not the place to stay. But the Poles didn't let them out anymore. And you know, there were pogroms, Kielce, maybe you know it, and so on. The atmosphere was not good, but they didn't manage to leave anymore. And so
this is 1947, right?
1946, 47, and then I was born, and my parents worked there in the hospitals, or well, my mother was a dentist, my father finished his studies and was a dermatologist. He didn't finish his studies before the war. He was 5 years younger than my mother. And so they were always writing letters to the government to let them go, because they had cousins who survived by the war in Russia, or before the war when they emigrated to France, to Australia, to the US, and they wanted to join them in Israel, but they were not allowed to go. But then in 1956 and 57 was an anti-Semitic campaign in Poland, Gomulka, maybe you know it, and they were allowed to leave. And so we emigrated the end of December 1957 to Israel.
So you were 10 years old.
I was 10 years old, and this is where I grew up. And my parents got work, found work after a while, both of them in Beersheba.
Medical work.
Desert. And I was, which I'm afraid it's not, you don't hear it by my language, but I don't use English anymore for many, many years. I write, but
you can't tell. You can't tell, Elvira. You're doing great.
And I was in an English boarding school in Jaffa. And I hated it there. It was a Christian Church of Scotland school. And I learned day and night and graduated from the high school 2 years ahead of time, just to get out. And I went to the university in Jerusalem. Before I went to the army. You had to go to the army in Israel when you're 18, but I was just 17, turned 17. And so I could start the studies. And then 3 years later, I had my BA, and I was supposed to go to the army. But I have met my husband in my last year at the university. He studied in Jerusalem, and we didn't want to part. And so I came to Germany because his scholarship ended there and he had to return. And that's why I'm here since November 9th, 1967, which is the day of the Kristallnacht, Kristallnacht, and the Nazis destroyed the synagogues and Jewish shops and so on. And when I came here on that date, I swore to myself that I will never stop fighting against anti-Semitism and never stopped fighting anti-Israelis. And this is going on. The fight is still today.
I understand. So let me take you a little bit backwards, and I'm going to ask you some questions about growing up with your survivor parents. Now, you just told us that they never spoke to you about their experiences. That marries my parents were both survivors also, mom from Auschwitz and my father from at 16 he escaped Nazi Germany in Berlin. So we have some underlying threads here. He was born in Stuttgart in 1921, and he escaped on the last Hadassah Aliot kinder transport at age 15 out of Berlin. And he traveled with 100 other teenagers from Berlin to Italy, and on a ship Galilee to Port Haifa, and then he lived on Kibbutz Yagor for that period of time. So
I know it.
And my parents actually, my mom was liberated from Auschwitz, went back to Košice, Czechoslovakia, and then eventually came to Israel as well, but she got denied 2,000, she was on a boat with 2,000 other immigrants, and they were denied access by the British in 1947, and she then had to spend a year in Cyprus. And so she eventually came to Tel Aviv because she had a cousin in Tel Aviv. But coming back to your side, your parents didn't speak, like my parents never spoke. So growing up in their home, what was it like for you? And you said you were an only child, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what was it like for you growing up in a survivor's home?
I always felt different. First of all, I was the darkest child in the whole city. And I didn't know that I'm Jewish, but I knew I'm different. And my parents, they had false papers, false documents. And when I was asked in school what was my mother's maiden name, for instance, so I asked my mother, what was your maiden name? What did she tell me? Lipska. All these lies they were used to during 6 years or 5 years, 6 years. She just continued to use. I didn't know my grandparents' names, real names. I didn't know my mother's history. I didn't know anything. And whenever I asked, why don't I have a brother or a sister like everybody else? There was silence. I was too little to understand. Why don't I have a grandmother or a grandfather like everybody else? No uncles, no aunts. They were just, you could see that they became like a stone. They were so tense.
Do you think their trauma that they faced was the reason why they didn't acknowledge even in Israel that they were Jewish?
When they went to Israel, of course, this changed. But in Poland, they never told me. You know how I found out that I'm Jewish? I went to my best friend, who was a Catholic, and her mother was an anti-Semite, a bad woman. Her father was very nice. I don't know if he was not Jewish, a little bit at least, but he was very kind to me. But her mother hated me. And then I didn't know that we were going to Israel. And this woman told me I got a winter jacket from my aunt from the United States in a parcel. And I was so proud of it. And I wore this jacket and I went to my friend, and her mother looks at it and says, there where you are going to, you won't need it. I said, where I'm going to? She said, you ask your parents. The whole city knew it because my parents were very well known. They were not communists, but they were personalities. And they didn't tell me. They prepared the immigration without telling me. I just didn't talk to my parents much. They were working, and then I talked to my dog. I had a dog. And the dog was sort of my brother, but he didn't tell me either that going to Israel. So, and I had to leave him in Poland. This was very sad for me. It was like a little bit of death, you know.
Yeah.
So I asked my parents when I came home, listen, what is it all about? I don't understand. And then they told me, and they showed me a catalog from Sochnut, from Jewish Agency, where children are eating oranges and dancing in the sun and happy, you know, horror. And I was really happy. I said, oh, great. That's where we're going to. And the whole problem was somehow not there anymore. I don't know why my parents kept secrets from me all the time. When we went to Israel, we had no apartment. We were in a tzrif, in a barrack, you know, so such a hut on the seaside, on the shore of Nahariya. There was no light, no electricity, no water, but we had, each one of us got 1 kilogram, 2 pounds of oranges as a welcome gift. So we were walking on the beach and eating oranges all day. And then my parents decided to go to Tel Aviv, where our family was, and their cousins. And so we moved from the tzrif to a hotel, which is still there, down at the Allenby. It's called Hotel Monopol. It's opposite the.
So were you? So you're now 10 years old. You're now in Israel. Clearly, there's. It sounds like there's a bit of a distance between you and your parents. Is that right?
Right. I always thought I was a gypsy child found on the street.
Oh, wow. So, and were they, as they went to Tel Aviv, did they get back into their medical profession in Israel?
Yeah, not in Tel Aviv, but in Beersheba.
Okay.
They worked. They came. Then there were over 50,000 Olim Chadashim with immigrants with academic professions. It was very difficult in 1957. It was just 9 years after the independence of Israel. The situation was difficult, and there was no work there where you wanted to, no work in Tel Aviv. So they went to Beersheba. And Beersheba was then a small place with eucalyptus trees and a tipat chalav, which you know maybe what it is. It is a meeting point for mothers, which was founded by the WIZO.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a new blocks which were built for the new comers, and there were many children of the immigrants, so I could play with them. And
so then this brings up another question for me. So you are now in Beersheba, and you are among other Holocaust survivor children.
Yeah.
Were some of those parents must have been talking to those children about their experiences in the Holocaust? Did you hear from those children about potential?
No, not a word, and not from the parents. We had neighbors from Holland, we had neighbors from Hungary, from Romania, from Poland. No, never. Our direct neighbors and friends, it was a couple, married couple. He was also a medical doctor, and his wife was a Ukrainian who converted to Judaism at some point. Not in Poland, but I guess in Israel. And they had 2 sons and a daughter, and the sons were not circumcised. But he was also a survivor, but he survived in the Soviet Union, so he didn't have the traumatic things my parents went through. He was somewhere in Caucasus or whatever. So and his wife wasn't Jewish. So this wasn't a topic either. I don't know. No,
So,
we
did you have any? So, for instance, my parents, who never spoke, never had any outward expressions that I could see something was wrong. Did your parents have any traumas or headaches or nightmares or anything that would appear to you that there was something off with your parents and their experiences of the war?
My mother was very sick when she came, when the war was over, and she had to go to places for cure, had liver problems and so on. So she was often missing at home. And I was brought up by a Polish nanny. So at that time, I knew that my parents were different from all other parents I knew, or my friends' parents and neighbors. They were all Polish Catholics, and they sent their children to the first communion. And they asked me, when will you be there? When will you get the communion? And I said, next year. And I asked my parents, what can we do? They said, next year. And the next year, this was the latest time, thank God we went to Israel. Yeah, I mean, I talked to my parents. My mother was drawing with me and they were helpful. And my father played the piano every day. He was a perfect pianist, never had learned to play, but he could by hearing. And I played with him and he liked it when we sat together at the piano and were playing four hands. And I had this was one of the topics we had in common. And
so let me stop you there, Elvira. I want to let everyone know that we've just completed our first episode of the Obligations of Memory podcast network for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm speaking with Dr. Elvira Groezinger from Berlin, and we're doing this through a great Zoom connection. We're going to come right back and continue our discussion with Dr. and see you on the other side.
What do you want to hear?
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Geisner from the Obligations of Memory podcast network for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm with Dr. Elvira Groezinger, who's a well-established educator and she's published over how many books? Not nine books, did you say? 6 books?
9 books.
Right. And we're talking about Elvira's opportunities of going from Poland as a child of age 10 to Israel, where she then grew up from 10 and went to the university. So let's talk about your university days. And you decided to leave. Were you still living at home or were you living outside of the home?
No, my home was in Beersheba and I studied in Jerusalem. And it was before the 6-day war. And it was a long travel of over 2 hours by bus every week, or almost every week. I went home for the weekend.
So when you decided to go to the university, that was the first time you were leaving home. And what was it like for you to leave home and for your parents to leave home?
No, I was all the years in the boarding school.
Ah, that's right.
The age of 11 to 16. And so I was used to not living at home.
Okay.
But my father got sick at the time. When he was 42, just shortly after we arrived, he got a bladder cancer and he died at the age of 49.
Oh, sorry.
So I came home every day and we talked, and it was a time when we got closer to each other. But there was no way to get behind their history in the wartime. Never. There was a wall which I could not
And how did your mother deal with the loss of of your father?
Very hard. He was the love of her life. He was very good looking. He was always in the middle of the society where they lived. When my parents lived, was a holiday resort in the mountains for Polish artists and writers who spent their holidays there. And they met in my parents' house. We had a house, and we had sort of a salon. My parents had them all, and they took pictures with me, and they loved me very much. They gave me their books, and they read me their stories, and they painted little things for me. So I was a little princess when we had guests. I don't know what they talked about because I was a child who had to go out when the grown-ups were there.
So how many languages do you speak?
6.
Which are?
Polish, Hebrew, well, English, you hear me, French, Yiddish, and German.
Very nice. So I can't compete with you. The only language I know is English, so sorry. But let me ask you, so what was it like to go to the university? Obviously, to be an intellectual, you're studying, and you're meeting other people who, again, are in Israel, who have the Holocaust in their background. Are you talking about the Holocaust when you were studying with your friends at the University of Jerusalem?
Not really, because we were young people. We wanted to learn, and it was a very, very hard learning. I had 35 hours of courses every week, and we wrote tests all the time and papers and so on. We had no time to deal with the past. We were happy about the present. We were going to theater, and we were an international group. There were American students, and my friends, we lived together. We studied everything from the first day we met at the university. 4 girls, one, her mother and her father were from Lithuania, and her mother was a nurse, and they were also with the Red Army in Berlin. They didn't survive a camp or ghetto or something. They were also a little bit younger than my parents, and my friend, who is still my friend, we kept on for now. I came here 67, 55 years. We're meeting every time I'm in Israel, and she's been here and so on. Her parents also came to Israel just after the war in 45, by Aliyah Bet, the illegal Aliyah, and were sent by the British to Italy. That's where my friend was born. So we always were joking, my Italian friend. This is the only thing we talked about the war. This was why her parents came to Israel at the time. And another one came together with me from Romania. She was at Hadassim at the WIZO high school, and her father was also a doctor, and he also died young when she was with me in the same situation, and but we don't have a contact anymore. She became a teacher. My other friend, the Italian, became a social worker, and I became a literary scholar. So we had 3 different careers, and the 4th girl was from the same little town, Kiryat Chaim, near Haifa, and as my friend, and she was born in Israel already. So her parents were from before the war in Palestine, and they had no reason to talk about the traumas.
Right.
So
we're for everyone listening, we're in somewhere around 1965, 1966. Is that correct?
yeah, and 64 to 67
Right.
was
Can you
when
give us a little bit of a landscape what Israel is like during this time? And we also, you mentioned that you're leading up to the 1967 war. So what was the environment to live in Israel like during this time?
um, um, it was very Zionistic. You know, we were dancing every year at the Yom Ha'atzmaut, at the Independence Day on the streets, and we were singing the songs, and it was a home, and it was a problematic home because the Arabs have always committed terror acts. There were always some tensions of political kind on the borders, and in 1967, when the war was nearing, this was the first time I got into panic. My father was dead already. That it's going to be a Shoah. If the Arabs come, they will murder us. So I was facing death, which I kept in my mind, which my parents went through and survived. They also survived, by the way. They were. This is something I want to tell you because that's why I'm able to live in Germany, you know, as a child of survivors, because my parents had met some Germans who were very helpful and very okay. They were deported to the Gestapo by a Polish Schmalzownik. Schmalzownik, probably know, were those who caught Jews or Jewish looking people on the street, and if you didn't pay, they handed you in to the Gestapo. And this is what happened to my parents when they were changing their hiding places. And this man went to the Gestapo and said, that's Jews, they spoke Yiddish. And my father never spoke Yiddish, he could not speak Yiddish. My father is a baron, an Austrian baron, a nobility, which spoke French at home and German on the street, and not Yiddish. And so they would never speak Yiddish between them, you know, on the street in Poland, fearing danger, never. And interestingly enough, my birth name is Weisberg, Baron von Weisberg. I'm a baroness, if Austria would have it, but it was abolished in 1918. And the Gestapo man was very cultivated and had the same name. And they talked to my parents, and they were talking about literature and music and so on. And he arrested the man who reported them, because he said, these people are never Jews. Maybe he knew, he didn't want to do anything. They understood each other. And this is one of the episodes, incidents, which my parents told me about.
Well,
and
it's fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing that, because it brings reality to a touching point. We so hate and think about Germans always in the most negative light. So it is nice to hear a story that you've just shared. So I want to take you a little bit forward. You talked about, you were worried about the show. It's very interesting. My parents who got married in 1950 in Tel Aviv, but they decided to leave Israel because they didn't want to. My father was fought in the war of 1948, and they didn't want to bring us or bring their children up in the constant threat of war. So they were sponsored to come to the United States, Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is where I was born. My sister, they came in 1954, pregnant with my sister. And even though my parents didn't speak about the war, but they did mention that the two reasons they came to the United States was that my mother was very successful. She had a beauty salon in Tel Aviv. My father was also successful. But they were concerned, like every year or I don't know what the frequency was, but their shekels were constantly devalued during that period. And so they were working and winding up not being able to have what they thought they had in the bank. And the other second reason, which was, I'm not sure which was the primary reason, was they're worried about bringing their children up in an atmosphere of war all the time. So they left Israel in 1954, and I was born in 1958. So I'm a little bit younger than you are, but
younger. You're 11 years younger than I am.
So you're basically now in the university. And tell me how you met your husband.
Yeah, met my husband in the Mensa, in the dining Mensa. He had striking blue eyes. He was smoking a pipe. And I was in Germany visiting my parents' friends who were survivors of Auschwitz, and the daughter, who was my friend, the only Jewish girl I knew, the other one in my home city. And they were always friends. We were friends. And they immigrated a year before we did to Israel. And then when the reparations came, from the Germans, they left Israel and went to Germany and got a lot of money for surviving Auschwitz and so on. And their daughter and I were once on a streetcar, and I was so happy to be in a streetcar. I knew it from Poland. There was no streetcar in Israel. And this was my gift for my graduation. I was 16, and I was on that streetcar and talked English to my girlfriend because we didn't want to speak Polish. And I didn't know that the streetcar can suddenly stop. I forgot it already. And so I sort of fell over a woman who was holding flowers in her hand, and the flowers fell down on the floor, and I picked them up and I said, "Excuse me." And she started screaming, "Those foreigners," really hateful. And I said, "Excuse me, never think I did nothing wrong." So I left Germany after 1 month. It was summer holiday. And I said, "Never again." And then I saw this man, and he was a German. And the never again changed into yes, again.
And what year are you now?
I'm now in Berlin.
But what year?
What do you mean?
When did you meet him?
Met him in 67, at the beginning of 67, his last year and my last year. But when he finished, he had to go home, and I would go to the army. So we would have to part for at least 2 years, which was.
And when did you get married?
I came on 9th of November to Germany with the permission for leave before I go to the army of 3 months in order to get married. I was supposed to return by January 9th if I would not get married. So we got married on the 2nd of January, and I skipped the army.
Right. And you stayed, and then you never went back to Israel, or you went back to Israel?
Well, my mother was in Israel. We were going every year.
Okay, and so talk to me about the first time you brought your husband to visit your mother. What was her as a survivor? She was meeting someone who was German. I'm interested to know that dynamic.
Yeah, my mother fell in love with my husband. He was such a nice boy and such a gentleman. And she cooked for him and she baked for him. And well, there was no problem. The only problem he had is that I would leave her alone, a widow, and go to Germany to marry. She was very unhappy about it. Not because it was Germany, but it was far away.
And what was it like going? He's obviously, is he Jewish or not? I'm not sure. He's not Jewish. So when you visited his family, what was it like to visit his family?
Yeah, I wasn't the first Jew in the family because his cousin married an American Jew who was in the army, his older cousin, much older. And this American Jew was an officer of the American army. It was in Stuttgart. My husband also comes from Stuttgart. And he fell in love with this. She was very pretty, the woman, and she went to the United States and married him. So there was already Jewish member of a family in the family. His parents were very nice, very direct, no problem. No one, I never felt anything. They were nice to me, and his father liked me very much. He always talked to me. He was very friendly, and his mother talked anyway to everybody. So there was no problem. And his sister was there, and he had two brothers in the United States, and they were also no problem. There were no problems. So I didn't feel strange in this family.
Okay, well, that's terrific. So you are now married, you're living in Berlin, and what's interesting is he is a professor, and I want to kind of understand the dynamic. He's a Jewish studies professor.
Yeah, because
so tell me a little bit about how he became a Jewish professor.
Yeah, well, it's he was studying theology, and he learned Hebrew, and this was a time when in 1966 when some young Germans went to Israel to, so to speak, because they felt guilty of what happened, and they wanted to learn to live there, how to live there among Jews, and to learn to know Jews and Jewish culture and so on. And he got a scholarship for 1 year, and he went to Jerusalem. And he found it extremely interesting. He traveled all over and studied archaeology with Igal Yadin, and great. And he was very gifted because he learned Hebrew very quickly, the spoken Hebrew, and he studied in Hebrew. It wasn't a school for foreign students. It was a regular curriculum he went through. So he came in the summer, and we met in March, at the beginning of March. And Israel became his home. He asked for the prolongation of his scholarship, but they didn't give it. They didn't want Germans to stay too long in Israel because some of them, not only he, brought Jewish women back with them. And I think the universities here didn't like it, to see that their students are going astray. especially as he didn't like the theology, but he studied it for some years and he wanted to finish it. So the church didn't want a minister, which they thought he would become, to live in intermarriage. They wanted them to marry Protestant women. But he wasn't obedient. And when he made his diploma, he started to study Semitic languages and more Jewish studies, which were then newly established in Germany. And he made a career in this. So, and he has this enormous output, this enormous amount of books and articles, and
so you're both Jewish scholars. You get married. What's your dinner conversation like?
A conversation. You're indiscreet. Yeah. No, we were not talking about the Shoah. We were talking about modern Germany, which was for me, as you heard, not the most pleasant place, because I was afraid of unsympathetic people with whom I would have to deal with. And but then he was in Israel in the 6-day war as well. And he was digging the trenches and was with the Haga. This is the security thing in Haifa, where he had some friends. And I was in Beersheba in the hospital. And when we met after the war, we didn't know we would survive and Israel would survive. It was clear to us that we're going to stay together, and I would go to Germany because we couldn't marry in Israel. It was an intermarriage, religious, only a chuppah, and I didn't want him to convert because he would never want me to convert.
So how long have you been married?
Pardon?
How long have you been married?
Now,
Yeah.
I'll be married in January for 55 years.
Mazel tov. That's terrific. And
yeah,
I'm going to sort of lead you now to what was it like to go back and live in Germany? I have my own set of experiences when I graduated from the university here. My parents gave me a trip, a summer trip, 3 months, all expenses paid, to go visit Europe. And I have a first cousin from my mother's side whose mother was a survivor from Auschwitz, from Košice, Czechoslovakia. He escaped. Russians came in 1967, and he moved to 1967, and then he moved to Aachen, Germany.
Oh,
right
he
on
fled.
He fled. He escaped, and he moved to Aachen because it was very close to the Belgian border. So he also was traumatized, and he wanted to be one step or 1 foot in both places. So if he needed to, he could leave. So what was it like as a Jewish woman coming from Israel? And you came in 1967, 68, right around 67, 68, 69. Okay, so what was it like at that time in Germany for a Jewish woman who is also intellectual Jewish woman, who's a scholar, bringing her education into Germany, which I have some parallels from my cousin, but I'm interested to hear from you what it was like bringing your Jewishness into the scholarly university, and especially the high German universities of Frankfurt and so on.
Heidelberg, first thing in Heidelberg. You know what I did there? I learned German, first of all. And it was an international institute for translators. And we were an international group of students, and we all learned very intensively German. And I'm not, well, I learned it very quickly. And then I started studying German literature. And I was an exotic person at the time. There weren't so many Israelis who came over. And I was popular. I had a friend from Egypt, a Coptic woman who was very interested in Israel, and we liked each other, and I was interested in Egypt, and she, we were friends because she suffered from the Muslim hatred as a Christian in Egypt. And this was shortly after the 6-Day War. But she didn't blame Israel for it. So it was interesting. I met so many people who were interested in Israel. But on the other hand, it was the 1968 student revolt. The leftists set sit-ins and teach-ins and so on. We had all these groups. And the Palestinians started their activity very aggressively against Israel. And they were aided by a Jewish student who was also extremely leftist then, who was their translator, so to speak, their German tongue of the Palestinian people, the liberation of Palestine, of this organization. And they were very aggressive against Israel.
In Germany, you're speaking.
In Germany. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have an Israeli embassy here yet in Germany, only a consulate general. And I asked them for information material, just to distribute it or
who is the them? I'm sorry to interrupt.
The diplomats.
Okay.
Israeli diplomats should help me to counteract this propaganda by the Arabs. And they were sleeping. As you know, maybe Hasbara in Israel has been very slow and very, I don't know, they weren't working properly. And I am a Zionist activist. And so I was collecting material all the time, and we had no internet at that time. So I was collecting brochures and contacts with people, and I was fighting the Palestinian revolt in Heidelberg by our activities. And also my first action in Germany was together with my then not yet husband, but my fiancé. There were elections in the area, in the federal land of Baden-Württemberg, where Heidelberg is. And they were everywhere were posters of the neo-Nazi party. And what did we do? It's not allowed, it's illegal. We tore down the posters. And we were caught by the police, and we were brought over to the police station. And I hardly spoke. This was maybe 3 weeks after I came. And my husband had to translate. And I spoke in English why I can't stand Nazi propaganda. These were the colors, like the swastika flag, but with other logo. And the policemen didn't understand really what the matter was, and but they had to do something. So they asked the police president, who was upstairs in his office, what to do. And he said, let them come. So we came there. There was a gentleman, and I spoke English to him, and my husband at times translated. He was very interested, and then suddenly he smiled so awkward, unsympathetic. And I told him, I'm a very aggressive person in this case. I told him, I don't see any reason for laughing or smiling. And he said, no, I'm a victim of Nazi, um, during the war of the Nazis. I'm also a victim. It's all right. And he sent us out without any punishment, anything. We were just free. Okay. The Nazi party got 10% in the federal place in this country, 10% in the parliament. It was a lot. So our action of tearing down the posters didn't really bring much. And okay, I had no problems at that time yet, not only with Arabs, not with the Nazis. And when we went 4 years later to Frankfurt, when my husband started his career on the tenure track, we read in the newspaper that the police president of Heidelberg was thrown out, was expelled from his office because he lied about his activity in the Third Reich.
Well, this is a really good place to take a pause. We've just completed our second episode of a terrific series of episodes with Dr. Elvira Groezinger from Berlin, talking about her life, her parents' life. This is the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner from the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group, and we're going to continue our discussion in a few minutes. We'll be back to pick it up. Hold on. Looking forward to seeing you again. Hi, this is Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligations of Memory podcast on the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube video. I'm with Dr. Elvira Groezinger, and we're having a series of episodic discussions about her life. We're now really discussing her time in Berlin when she started to make a career, and her husband is also making a career. They've just moved to the Heidelberg area, and she just told an incredible story about what the state of life was in Germany at that time. We're talking about 1967 to 1970. Is that correct, Elvira?
71, yes.
That's
40 Heidelberg.
So you're now making a career in Heidelberg at the university, both of you. You're both scholars in Jewish studies. So I would ask you, what was it like at the leadership level of the University of Heidelberg, and the tenor of anti-Semitism? Did you experience any at the university?
At the university, no. Even in the German literature studies, in the courses, and no, on the contrary, it was a time when they discovered Jewish writers. I don't know if you know Paul Celan. He's a poet from Czernowitz, and he was a survivor of the Shoah, and he wrote in German because Czernowitz was Austrian Empire before the war. His parents were murdered, and he wrote some of the first poems on Shoah. And they were in the curriculum, and they were, the students knew them. And so it was very interesting for me to see the reaction of the Germans. At that time, they were still reading books and learning poetry. It was a cultivated atmosphere. We had good professors, and one of them was teaching about German culture, had a lecture for foreign students. And I went there. He wrote a book, a very interesting book on German culture from, I don't know, from the Middle Ages until 20th century. And he was singing the Schumann songs to the texts of Heinrich Heine, you know, and was great. And I wrote my diploma paper, my dissertation on Heinrich Heine, the rabbi from Bacharach, which is an absolutely Jewish topic, one of the few of by Heine. And I got an A from this professor. And I was very happy. And then also much later, I discovered that when I already could make the research on internet, that he was the rector of the University of Lüttich in Belgium during the occupation. He was a Nazi appointed head of the university.
So how did that make you feel?
Well, I learned a lot from him. And I think still that my dissertation was excellent. But I was irritated because he was so cultivated. He knew so much. He spoke languages and, he was a fascinating person. I never read about any atrocities he might have, I don't know, committed. But the fact that he was in a Nazi in Belgium, an occupant, was a shock.
So let me, when I visited on my trip in 1980 to many places, my cousin took me around to all the major areas, Frankfurt, Berlin, we went to Aachen, and the thing that I was noticing more than anything else was the older people sitting on the bench. And I constantly couldn't get it out of my head to say, what were they doing during the war? So I'm going to ask you that same question. And now, obviously, that demographic has passed on at this point, or they're certainly in their 90s, or they're no longer sitting on a bench. But you came in 1970, and it had to be, wherever you went, there had to be a question as to a native German, what did you do? So how did you reconcile that being a Jew in Germany?
Well, absolutely. I was brought up to be very polite, to get up when all the people enter a streetcar or a bus and leave them the place. I never did it anymore because I said I will never stand up to an older German person, and make him sit and me stand as a Jew. I don't know what he did during the war. It was in my head. So I know exactly what you mean. I would never be able to work in an old people's homes, although they are much younger. They were not Nazis anymore. People my age are born after the war, and if they were 10 years older, 85, they were children during the war. So they are not perpetrators. But I worked as a volunteer I was very engaged in Jewish community, in the social and cultural sectors, and I was a visitor of old people there who had no family. So I was sort of regular visitor, came every week, brought them flowers and went shopping for them and talked to them. And it was a Jewish nursing home, never a German.
And so the question I have for you, my son, who's 32, he travels around the world. He's a partner at a firm called Boston Consulting Group. He loves going to Berlin. He says when he ever goes to Europe, he has to go to Berlin. He loves the city. So what is he seeing? I haven't gone back to Berlin since 1980. I still have much difficulty, as I just mentioned to you, even though time has gone on. But what is exciting about Berlin? Why are you loving Berlin? And why did you make it your home?
Well, I didn't make it my home. My husband got a chair here, so we moved. We were in Sweden before, he had chairs elsewhere, but Berlin is, it became the capital of Germany shortly after we moved. And it is a city like Tel Aviv, you know, lots of gays and lesbians, and it's young people from all over the world come, and there are 20,000 Israelis who left Israel and live in Berlin and think it's much better. First of all, it used to be cheaper. It's not cheap anymore. It was cheaper than Israel. You know, Israel has very high costs of living, but they feel like in Tel Aviv. You have lots of dogs. You're free. You only don't have the sea. That's all. No shore. But otherwise, you have the discos and the clubs. I have a grandson who is now 18. He knows all the clubs in the city and he thinks the city is absolutely cool. For young people, I'm too old. I never been to the clubs. I don't know what he's talking about, but I suppose there must be something about the atmosphere. All the people, you know, even my cousin, I have a cousin who's second cousin in the United States. He was a doctor, transplantation surgeon, and he has 2 children, and his children were never in Germany. And one day, his wife, who is daughter of Romanian Jews, forced him to make a stop in Frankfurt on the Main when they were on the way to somewhere, I don't know. Frankfurt on the Main has the biggest airport in Germany. And so they stayed in the hotel. And he refused to set his foot on German soil. He's a child survivor. And we came to the hotel to visit him. And later, the children of other cousins, they all came to Berlin, and his son is a gay and wanted to come to Berlin as well. And we had a mayor who was a gay man. And so, you know, I just told him, don't worry. It's an open city. He can come and he'll meet here all the Israelis, all the Americans, all the Jews. We have 200 Jews in Germany, 200,000, but as I say, 30,000 Jews in Berlin, among them over 20,000 Israelis. He will feel at home. And that's how it was.
You know, I have, to learn my parents' story, I've watched many, many Holocaust films, and I'm afraid to even tell you, I've watched over 500 Holocaust films. And there's a film called Back to the Fatherland, which is all about young Israelis who are upset with the lack of a two-state solution, deciding to give up on Israel, and they're all coming to Berlin or to Germany. And it was a very interesting movie. You can watch it on, I don't know whether it's available in Berlin and on Amazon Prime, but it is a very interesting movie to watch how the young people, many of them, are migrating out of Israel. You're speaking right to that cluster of demographics, and that's it. So I want to kind of segue. We're coming close to the end of our 3rd episode. Tell me about, do you feel you have inherited any traumas from your parents? And if your children, who are all adults now, right? You have one daughter who's a dermatologist, obviously followed your parents' medical footsteps.
My father, but she didn't know him.
Okay. All right. So how do you see yourself? Is there any trauma that you can identify from your parents in you? And can you identify how you transferred any of that trauma into your daughter?
Yeah. My daughter is a very healthy person psychologically, fortunately. But she always made a reproach. She reproached me for having been an overprotective mother. And that's right. I'm a typically Jewish mother and grandmother. I'm worrying about my children, my family all the time, never about myself. I don't care. I would like to live, and I hope I will live for much longer. But it's just the fear that something might happen. I think it's a trauma which I got from my parents and which I gave on to her, but against which she is defending herself. She doesn't want to follow the line, you know. But she read, as a child, she read enormous amount of children's Holocaust literature. Every book that there was on the market, and there were many,
So
she read.
What caused her, since your parents didn't speak, and I assume, tell me about, did you speak to your child about the Holocaust, and at what age did you felt appropriate to do that?
Well, when she came to school, she was also in a group. When she was in high school, she was the youngest. She was 13 then, in a local history school group from different grades, and they made local history of the place where we lived near Frankfurt. There's a Jewish cemetery where my mother is buried, and the school in which she was is taking care of it. They digitalized the graves and they made research. There were nameless graves of deported Jews or who who committed suicide in order not to be deported. It's not a destroyed cemetery, and the children, young pupils, students, were taking care of it. And
what age?
From 13 to 18.
Mm-hmm.
18. And one day, this was on May 8th, when I remember there was a trip to France, to Stutthof. It's a concentration camp in Alsace, near Strasbourg. And the group, this was a group of students from different ages. Me and another mother accompanied the group of maybe 20 students who were in this course, an advanced history course, Jewish history and Holocaust history. And we went to France, to the camp. And this was, on the way, the teenager was singing, making jokes, and we arrived there. It's up on the mountain, beautiful view, and it's a little Auschwitz with crematoriums and terrible. And they became very quiet and shocked. And one of the students asked the teacher, who could do such a thing? Who did this? And the teacher said, the barbarians. And I said, no, it was grandfather and grandmother. And the teacher said, well, yes, you're right. And on the way back, it was absolutely still on the bus, 4 hours drive. And the other mother, her son was 17 at that time, told me he cried the whole night through. And German pupils and students, many of them used to go to Auschwitz as a part of school curriculum. And it impressed them very much. I think it's necessary that they see what what was done by their ancestors.
Now you said that they used to go. Was that a misquote, or that they were
It's not,
still going?
not there anymore. And I know many of my age, more or less 70 years old, who as teenager went to Auschwitz with their schools.
So I saw, we have a scaling anti-Semitism problem in the United States.
Mhm.
And I saw that in Berlin, you have a beautiful Holocaust,
And
how to describe it, but there are these granite blocks that are somewhere.
yeah,
Okay. But I saw that it was violated with the swastika this last week or so. And so what is the state of, what you're experiencing about anti-Semitism, the rise of the Nazi Party in Berlin today, and the government today?
well, I'm politically active. I'm.
I know you are, and so I'm giving you an open forum to be able to speak whatever you would like and tell the audience whatever you choose to say.
Well, I was the personal assistant to the then president of Jews in Germany, Ignaz Bubis, a legendary figure. He was a survivor as well. And he was very authentic. He was a personality, everybody adored him or hated him. And at that time, the issue of the monument was raised. The monument.
What is the name of the monument, so the listeners know?
Denkmal für die ermordeten Juden Europas. And the lady who initiated it, I'm friendly with this, she's a friend of mine. It was, it is the most expensive piece of land in Berlin. It's right in the middle, very near to the Brandenburger Tor, the Brandenburger Gate, and to the government place, to the Reichstag, to our parliament. So it is practically a visiting card for entry to Berlin. Whoever, as an official guest, is coming to Berlin has to see it. And this was the debate then. Why should it be erected? It's not, it's a very problematic place because the architect wanted it to be an open place, excuse me, and where young people can play and sit on it and eat and drink. While others said, if it's a monument of tragedy, it should be respected. So there was a big controversy whether it should come or not. And at the end, Bubis, the president of of Jews, excuse me, said, I want this place to have this place because people who don't have a grave have it, are symbolically there, and every German and every guest has to go by and see it. So I think it's important to have it. I don't feel anything there, but it's for other people. It's not for the Jews, I would say. Sorry.
It's okay, I know.
So my COVID, my lungs don't make it. We have a problem with raising anti-Semitism. We have 6 million Muslims here who are not all Jew-friendly, to say the least. We have the right party, and we have the very leftists who are BDS supporters. And I am on the International Board of Scholars of Peace in the Middle East. It's an international organization with 50,000 members who are pro-Israel and for academic integrity, and we try to make people who are educating others understand and transport the knowledge about the Middle East conflict and about the history of Israel and of Palestine and so on. And I always say, don't say Palestinians, I say always Palestinian Arabs, because they're also Palestinian Jews. So for me, it is a matter of life and death to be able to live here in security and not be attacked on the street because, well, unfortunately, I don't wear my Magin David anymore. I used to, but it's too dangerous. I don't want to be attacked for it. People who wear kippah were beaten up. If you speak Hebrew on the street, you can be beaten up by Palestinians, not by the Nazis. The Nazis are different. And at some point, when my daughter was still in school 30 years ago, we were on a death list of neo-Nazis as Jews. And they tried to burn down our house. It didn't happen, but they placed a burning device in front of our wooden door, and they were riding bicycles in front of our house, screaming, Jews raus, Juden raus, Jews get out. And this stopped. There was a group of neo-Nazis in the neighboring city, and some of them had connections to my daughter's high school. So they knew she is Jewish, and they detected where we lived, and I was connected with the General Council of Jews in Germany, so we had a problem of this kind. But my husband, after some of these people were identified, and there was among them one co-pupil from my daughter's school, my husband called the father and told him, listen, your son is doing this, do you know it? No, he was shocked. And it was a family of a leader of a neo-Nazi group, well known in Germany. And it seems that there was some familiar conflict, and it stopped. But, being threatened by death, I was very worried about my daughter, not about myself. I can defend myself. I've survived the Arabs. I could survive the Nazis too, I always said. But my daughter, she was on her way to school all alone. And then there were such types there. But thank God, nothing happened.
So is your daughter living in Germany as well?
She's living in Berlin, has her own practice, yes. And she's very well known dermatologist. And
did she marry a Jewish man?
Yeah. He is son of...
Second gen?
Yeah. His father was a survivor of Transnistria camps in Romania, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was very traumatized, the father, extremely.
So let me ask you, Elvira, we're getting close to the end of our third episode, and I want to leave our interview series with you, but I want to give you an open opportunity to speak about anything that you would like to for our audience. And I know that you're very political, you are very Zionist, you have your heart on your sleeve, as we have seen in the last hour or so. So please take the audience time here to express yourself however you would like.
Well, I've always been an optimist, and I always thought, well, things will get better. But in Germany, not just in Germany, I see it on the campuses in the US and whatever happens there. in general, the anti-Semitism is growing again. And in Germany, we even have anti-Semitism commissioners in different institutions and a federal one. It's a new development.
What is an anti-Semitism commissioner?
Well, it's a person who is politically active to prevent anti-Semitism in the society. He, the federal one, he made up a whole amount of places where people can report anti-Semitic incidents, for instance, and they're going to be they're noted, and then there's a police investigation in most cases. Because if you're just an individual, not known and not very important, and attacked anti-Semitically, the police didn't really care about it. But now they have to, because it is it's a political institution. There are commissioners in the police, there are commissioners in the local councils of places, different places, and they organize information events to inform teachers, policemen, lawyers, and judges, and whatever, about groups which are anti-Semitic in this society, about the dangers, about the consequences. And well, we work together, me from Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, and they on information at universities, the academia, because people, as you know, students are militant, and we have more and more Muslim students. We also have more and more Jews who support BDS, and we had, due to the awareness which has come in now, a declaration by the German parliament that BDS is an anti-Semitic movement, and that cities, they are free in doing it, they should not, for instance, give public places for their activities, not in academies, not in schools, not in places which are financed by public money. Private places, you cannot do anything against it. It's free opinion. But if these places are financed by the state, there should be no BDS activities, because they are, according to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic. And in Germany, officially, there is no place for anti-Semitism anywhere. But it doesn't always work like that, and not every city obeys. And so the situation here is very unpleasant, because we have more and more academics who do what they want, and they attack Israel, criticize Israel, invite Israel enemies for talks, for conferences. So I'm pessimistic in the meantime. Maybe it's my age, but I lost my optimism that things are going to be better. And this is an alarm sign for me that a country needs anti-Semitism commissioners to fight anti-Semitism in the society. It's incredible for me.
Well, I want to leave it on that note, and I want to let everyone know that you've been listening to Dr. Elvira Groezinger, who is a Jewish scholar living in Berlin, also lived in Israel for a period of time. You're listening to Jeffrey Geisner from the Obligation of Memory Podcast Network for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I want to again thank you so much, Elvira, for spending the time with us and giving us your perspective, your history, your family's history, your parents' history. And I think it's terrific what you're doing as far as being a champion for anti-Semitism in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot for your work.